The metal casing of the Copenhagen ring station groaned under the strain of neglect. Once a magnificent orbital archive, the ring now resembled a dying leviathan, its vast corridors choked with frost, its systems failing one by one. Bulkheads that once gleamed now flaked with rust. Pipes that once hummed with energy now rattled and wheezed, pushing what little heat remained to the handful of occupied sectors. In the abandoned wasteland of Deck 13, snow spiraled through a hairline fracture in the outer hull, gathering in crystalline drifts against the walls. The temperature had plummeted weeks ago when the heating system finally surrendered. Ice crept along walls like invasive mold, claiming every surface in intricate patterns of white. Here, huddled in the corner of what once had been a maintenance closet, Seren trembled. Her pale blue skin, characteristic of the Verilon people, had taken on an alarming grayish tinge. Her limbs, once graceful and fluid, now stiffened with each passing hour. The torn remnants of her clothing, all she had managed to salvage from her destroyed transport vessel, hung in singed tatters around her thin frame. Around her neck, a teardrop pendant glinted dully in the emergency lighting. It was the last relic of her home, containing a fragment of her brother's voice, before the Quran Syndicate had taken everything else. 3 distinct piles of ash marked the floor beside her, evidence of her desperate battle against the cold. The first, the remains of her outer garments, burned on the first night. The second, insulation foam ripped from a wall panel and set alight on the second night. The third, strips of her own clothing, sacrificed to the flames on the third night. Now, as the temperature dropped further, Seren's hands trembled as she fingered the last scraps of fabric she wore. Would they be enough to keep her alive until morning? Her vocal cords, damaged by the Syndicate's harmony filters, could produce no cry for help. Only a soft, rasping wheeze escaped her lips as she curled tighter, conserving what little heat remained in her core. Miles away, in the still functioning Archive Block A, Kelvin Thorne sat hunched over a control panel. The soft blue glow from the screen illuminated his gaunt features. A man who spent too many hours alone with his memories, and not enough with other living beings. As the station's sole remaining archivist, he monitored the vast collection of memory crystals that contained the last records of countless extinct or endangered languages. The crystals lined the walls around him, each one glowing with a soft, pulsing light. Some contained entire languages, syntax, vocabulary, pronunciation guides. Others preserved only fragments, a lullaby, a prayer, a dying poet's final verse. All were precious. All were his responsibility. A sudden alert flashed across his screen. Emergency heat failure, Deck 13. Kelvin frowned. Deck 13 had been officially abandoned for months. According to protocol, he should simply log the alert and wait for the maintenance drones to investigate during their next scheduled sweep. But something, perhaps the same instinct that had led him to save so many forgotten languages, made him hesitate. The last time he'd ignored such an alert, they'd found the body 3 days later, an unauthorized passenger hiding in a service duct. By the time the drones located him, it had been too late. Not this time, Kelvin muttered, rising from his chair. He pulled on a thermal jacket, gathered emergency supplies, and headed for the transport tube. The journey to Deck 13 was arduous. The transport tube only functioned to Junction C, forcing Kelvin to navigate the rest of the distance on foot through icy corridors. His breath clouded before him as he moved, thermal scanner in hand, following the heat signature that shouldn't exist. When he finally reached the maintenance closet, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. A woman, no, not human, a Verilon female lay curled in the corner, her body nearly transparent with cold. Around her, the 3 piles of ash told their own story of desperate survival. Her clothes were charred at the edges, her fingers blackened with soot. A thin layer of frost had begun to form on her eyelashes. For a moment, Kelvin stood frozen in the doorway. Then, The training ingrained in him from his days as a senior linguist took over. He dropped to his knees beside her, checking for life signs. Her pulse fluttered weakly beneath his fingertips. But it was there. "You're alive," he whispered, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Stay with me." Working quickly, he wrapped her in emergency thermal blankets, activated heat packs, and administered the basic nutrients he'd brought. Her body temperature was dangerously low, but not yet beyond recovery. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms, struck by how little she weighed, and began the treacherous journey back to Archive Block A. Each step on the ice-slick floor threatened disaster. Once, he nearly fell, catching himself against a wall just in time. The Verilon woman didn't stir, didn't make a sound. Only the slight rise and fall of her chest beneath the blankets assured him that death hadn't claimed her yet. It took nearly 2 hours to reach the relative warmth of his quarters. By the time he laid her on his cot, Kelvin's arms trembled with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. He activated the medical protocols on his station interface, following the instructions to slowly raise her core temperature. "Too fast and the shock will kill you," he murmured as he worked. "Too slow, and you'll never wake." He brewed bark broth, the closest approximation he had to the nutrient-rich beverages Verilons consumed, and carefully trickled it between her blue-tinged lips. Hour after hour, he monitored her vital signs, adjusted the heating units, administered more broth. Dawn came and went, marked only by the subtle shift in the station's lighting cycle. It was late in the afternoon when her eyelids finally fluttered. Kelvin, dozing in his chair beside the cot, jerked awake at the slight movement. Her eyes, when they opened, were the color of distant stars, silver with hints of blue around the iris. They fixed on him with obvious confusion, then darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. Instead, her hand went to her throat, fingers tracing a thin, barely visible scar that encircled her neck like a necklace. "You're safe," Kelvin said softly. "I found you on Deck 13. You were burning your clothes to stay warm." Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed immediately by alarm. She tried to sit up, only to fall back as weakness overcame her. "Easy," Kelvin cautioned. "You nearly froze to death. Your body needs time to recover." She stared at him, and in that stare, Kelvin read a lifetime of suspicion. Whoever she was, whatever had brought her to the abandoned deck of a forgotten space station, trust did not come easily to her. Kelvin moved slowly to his workstation, selecting a small crystal from the thousands cataloged there. He returned to her side and held it up so she could see its gentle purple glow. "Verilon," he explained. "I have records of your language. Not complete, but enough that we might understand each other, if you're willing to try." Her eyes widened, and for the first time, emotion other than fear crossed her features. She reached for the crystal with trembling fingers. When Kelvin placed it in her palm, she closed her eyes, clutching it to her chest as though it were more precious than air. When she opened her eyes again, something had changed. The suspicion hadn't vanished, but alongside it now shone a fragile hope. Kelvin activated his translation interface and spoke carefully into it. "My name is Kelvin Thorne. I am the archivist here. Can you tell me your name?" The interface hummed, translating his words into the musical language of the Verilon. The sound of it filled the small room. Strange, yet beautiful. The woman's face transformed at the sound, her expression one of both pain and longing. She opened her mouth, tried to speak, but only a rasping noise emerged. Frustration darkened her features. Her fingers traced the scar on her throat again, then made a cutting motion. "Your voice," Kelvin said, understanding dawning. "They took your voice." She nodded, her silver eyes bright with unshed tears. "The Syndicate?" he guessed, and her sharp intake of breath confirmed it. The Quran Syndicate's methods were well documented in the archives. They harvested the vocal abilities of certain species, Verilons included, to use as biological keys for their sound locks. The procedure was barbaric, leaving the victims alive but voiceless, their identity, their very essence, stolen. "I'm sorry," Kelvin said, and meant it. "We'll find another way to communicate." Over the next several days, as Seren's strength gradually returned, they developed a system. Kelvin would play snippets from the Verilon language crystal, and she would point to words or phrases that expressed her meaning. For more complex ideas, she would sketch images on a datapad he provided. He learned that her name was Seren, that she had escaped from a syndicate facility by hiding in a cargo hold, and that the transport vessel had been attacked and damaged, forcing her to jettison in an escape pod. The pod's navigation system had malfunctioned, bringing her to the Copenhagen Ring rather than the refugee outpost she'd been aiming for. She had been on Deck 13 for 3 nights before Kelvin found her. 3 nights of burning whatever she could find to ward off the killing cold. 3 nights of silent terror, certain that death would find her before rescue did. In turn, Kelvin told her of his own exile. Once a senior linguist for the Galactic Cultural Bureau, he had been sent to the Copenhagen Ring as punishment for preserving languages deemed unnecessary noise by the Bureau's efficiency algorithms. His crime: hiding refugee language patterns in his personal archives, rather than allowing them to be deleted to make room for more valuable data. They called it data hygiene, he explained bitterly, as if an entire people's way of speaking, their stories, their songs, were nothing but clutter to be swept away. Seren's expression told him she understood all too well. On the 7th day, as Kelvin prepared their meal, a sound made him turn. Seren stood in the doorway, her hand at her throat, her lips moving. A whisper, barely audible, emerged. "Kel-Vin." His name, spoken in her damaged voice, felt like a gift he hadn't earned. "Seren," he replied, her name a prayer on his lips. She took a step forward, swayed, and would have fallen if he hadn't crossed the room to catch her. For a moment, they stood there, his arms supporting her weight, her face turned up to his. Something shifted between them, a current of understanding that transcended words. "You need to rest," he said, helping her back to the cot that had become hers. She shook her head, frustration evident in every line of her body. Her lips moved again, struggling to form words her damaged vocal cords couldn't quite produce. Kelvin retrieved the datapad, but instead of taking it, Seren pointed to the wall of memory crystals. Her meaning was clear. "You want to see more of the archives?" he asked. She nodded emphatically. Over the following days, as Seren's strength and voice gradually returned, Kelvin showed her the vast collection of memory crystals. Each one contained fragments of languages, songs, stories, the cultural heritage of countless civilizations. Some were well documented, others existed only in these fragile crystal repositories. Seren was particularly drawn to a section that contained Verilon vocal patterns. When Kelvin played them, her eyes closed in concentration, her lips moving silently, as though reciting along with the recordings. "You recognize these?" Kelvin observed. She nodded, then managed to whisper, "Voice keeper." "Voice keeper," Kelvin repeated, unfamiliar with the term. Seren struggled visibly, her hands moving in explanatory gestures that Kelvin couldn't quite follow. Finally, she drew a simple diagram on the datapad, a circle of figures, with one highlighted, an arrow pointing from that figure's mouth to the ears of the others. "A keeper of voices," Kelvin interpreted. "Someone who preserves oral traditions? A storyteller?" Seren shook her head, frustrated. She drew again, the same circle, but this time the arrow went from one figure's mouth to another's, then to another's, forming a complete circuit. "You pass it on," Kelvin said slowly. "The voice, the songs, The stories. You're not just keeping them. You're a link in a chain of transmission. Her face lit up. Yes, she whispered. Was voice keeper. Understanding dawned. That's why the syndicate wanted you specifically. Not just any Verilon voice. A voice keeper's voice. A voice that contains... what? Passwords? Keys to cultural repositories? Seren nodded, her expression grave. She pointed to her pendant, then to her throat, then made a turning motion, as if unlocking a door. Your voice is a key, Kelvin breathed. That's why they didn't kill you. They needed your voice alive, even if separated from you. She nodded again, her silver eyes haunted by memories. But you escaped, Kelvin continued, and now they're hunting you. Seren didn't need to confirm this. They both knew the syndicate would never abandon such a valuable asset. It was only a matter of time before they tracked her to the Copenhagen ring. That night, as Seren slept, Kelvin stood at the viewport, staring out at the vast emptiness of space. The station's exterior lights illuminated swirling ice crystals that had escaped from damaged sections of the hull. They looked like stars, he thought, frozen, drifting, lost. Like Seren, like himself. The realization that he would protect her, whatever the cost, settled over him with the weight of certainty. Not just because she was a living repository of a culture the galaxy was rapidly forgetting, but because in her eyes, he had glimpsed a kindred spirit, someone who understood the value of preservation, of memory, of not allowing the past to be erased for convenience. The next morning, Kelvin was awakened by a soft sound. Seren stood before the wall of memory crystals, her lips moving, producing sounds that weren't quite words, but carried melody nonetheless. She was practicing, he realized, struggling to reclaim her voice through sheer force of will. He watched silently, unwilling to interrupt her concentration. Her determination was both heartbreaking and inspiring. When she finally noticed him and stopped, embarrassment coloring her cheeks, he simply said, "Don't stop on my account. It was beautiful." "Not beautiful," she rasped. "Broken." "Healing," he corrected gently. "Like you." That day, Kelvin brought out special equipment from the linguistics lab, tools designed to analyze and reconstruct damaged vocal patterns. Originally intended for restoring corrupted audio in memory crystals. They might, he hoped, help Seren regain more of her voice. "I'm not a medical doctor," he warned, "but I understand sound patterns better than most. If you're willing to try." Seren's eager nod was all the answer he needed. They spent hours recording the sounds she could make, analyzing them against the intact Verilon vocal patterns in the archive, identifying the damaged frequencies. By evening, they had created a rudimentary therapy regimen, exercises to strengthen specific vocal muscles, tones to practice that might bypass the worst of the damage. "It won't be the same," Kelvin cautioned. "The harmony filters they used, they're designed to be permanent, but we might be able to recover enough for more comfortable speech." "Enough to sing?" Seren asked, her damaged voice barely audible. The question caught Kelvin off guard. "To sing? I don't know. That requires more complex vocal control than speech." Seren's expression fell, but she nodded acceptance. Then, to Kelvin's surprise, she reached up and removed the teardrop pendant from around her neck. She held it out to him, her eyes intense with unspoken meaning. Kelvin took it carefully. "What is this?" "My brother," she whispered. "His voice. Last recording." The significance of what she was sharing wasn't lost on Kelvin. This wasn't just a keepsake. It was possibly the last intact recording of a voice keeper's complete vocal pattern, a priceless cultural artifact and, more importantly, a deeply personal treasure. "Why show me this now?" he asked. Seren touched her throat, then pointed to the pendant, then to the vast array of memory crystals that lined the walls. "You want to preserve it," Kelvin interpreted, Add it to the archives. She nodded, then added, and use it to fix my voice. Kelvin's professional excitement warred with ethical caution. Seren, using your brother's vocal pattern as a template might help, but it wouldn't restore your exact voice. And extracting the data without damaging the original. It's delicate work. Trust you, she said simply. Those two words, spoken with such certainty despite her damaged voice, struck Kelvin deeply. When had anyone last trusted him with something so precious? Working with painstaking care, Kelvin extracted the audio data from the pendant, creating multiple backups before attempting any analysis. What he found left him speechless. The recording contained not just a voice, but a complex acoustic pattern, a naming chant, according to the translated metadata. It was a map in sound, a key to navigational points expressed through precise, tonal shifts that no mechanical device could replicate. Only a trained voice keeper could produce the exact frequencies needed to activate whatever locks this key was designed to open. This is why they wanted your voice, Kelvin said, understanding dawning. Not just for standard sound locks. This would give them access to something far more significant. Seren nodded grimly. Ancestral, vaults, cultural, weapons. Weapons, Kelvin repeated, alarmed. She shook her head, frustrated by her limited vocabulary. After several attempts to explain verbally, she resorted to the datapad, drawing a series of concentric circles with symbols between them. Sonic, shields, she managed. Protection, not attack, for colonies. Kelvin studied the drawing, understanding gradually forming. Defense systems keyed to voicekeeper chants. Ingenious. And if the Syndicate gained access, colonies vulnerable, Seren confirmed. The gravity of the situation settled over them. This wasn't just about one refugee's safety, or even the preservation of cultural heritage. The Syndicate could potentially neutralize the defenses of entire Verilon settlements. We need to warn them, Kelvin said. Seren's expression darkened. She shook her head, then struggled to articulate. No. Communications. Syndicate. Monitors. Find us. She was right. Of course. Any attempt to send a message to Verilon colonies would create a data trail the Syndicate could follow. They were trapped in an impossible situation. Remain silent and leave the colonies vulnerable. Or warn them and risk bringing the Syndicate down on their heads. Unless. What if we could restore your voice enough to recreate the chant? Kelvin suggested. Change the keys? Render what they stole from you useless? Hope flickered across Seren's features, quickly replaced by doubt. She gestured to her throat, the implication clear. The damage was too severe. It won't be easy, Kelvin acknowledged. But between your brother's recording and the vocal rehabilitation techniques, it might be possible. Not to match your original voice exactly, but to hit the critical frequencies needed for the chant. For the first time since he'd found her. Serene smiled, a fragile, hopeful expression that transformed her face. Try, she whispered. The work began in earnest the next morning. Kelvin converted part of his quarters into a makeshift sound laboratory, using equipment borrowed from the linguistics department. Hours stretched into days as they methodically mapped the frequencies in the naming chant, identifying which ones Seren could still produce and which would need to be worked around. During breaks, they shared meals and stories, Kelvin of his life before exile, Seren of her training as a voicekeeper. Despite the limitations of her damaged voice, a bond formed between them, built on shared purpose and growing trust. On the 10th day, as Seren practiced a particularly difficult tonal sequence, an alarm blared through the archive block. Kelvin's interface flashed red. Security alert. Unauthorized docking. Bay 7. Serene froze, panic evident in her expression. It might not be them, Kelvin said, but neither of them believed it. The Copenhagen ring received official visitors rarely, and never without advance notice. Unauthorized docking was practically unheard of, unless someone had disabled the security protocols. Someone like the Quran Syndicate. "We need to move," Kelvin said, already gathering essential equipment. "They'll check life support signatures first. We need to be somewhere they won't expect." Serene nodded, her movements quick and decisive despite her lingering weakness. She pointed to the station schematic displayed on Kelvin's workstation, indicating a section of Deck 13 not far from where he had found her. "Cold," she whispered. "Masks. Heat signatures." It was risky. The same cold that would hide their thermal signatures could kill them if they stayed too long. But with Syndicate hunters closing in, they had few options. They worked rapidly, packing survival gear, the vocal rehabilitation equipment, and most importantly, the memory crystal, now containing a backup of the naming chant. Kelvin hesitated over his archived languages, decades of work contained in fragile crystal matrices. "Leave," Seren urged, understanding his conflict. "Not worth life." She was right, but it felt like abandoning children to a fire. In the end, Kelvin selected only the most endangered records, languages with fewer than a dozen living speakers, and added them to their pack. The journey to Deck 13 was even more treacherous than before. They avoided the main corridors and transport tubes, using maintenance ducts and emergency ladders instead. Twice they froze in place as patrol drones hummed past, their sensors sweeping for unauthorized life forms. By the time they reached the abandoned deck, Seren was trembling with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The temperature had dropped even further in the days since Kelvin had found her, ice now coating every surface in crystalline sheets. They established a temporary shelter in a maintenance room with an emergency power outlet, enough to run the small heater they'd brought, but not enough to register on the station's power grid. The space was cramped, barely large enough for both of them and their equipment, but it would have to do. "Rest," Kelvin instructed, helping Seren settle on a thermal blanket. "I'll keep watch." But Seren shook her head, pointing to the vocal equipment they'd brought. "No time," she whispered. "Must finish." Her determination was humbling. Despite everything, the cold, the exhaustion, the hunters on their trail, she remained focused on their goal, to render useless the voice the Syndicate had stolen from her. They worked through the night, Seren practicing the modified chant sequences, while Kelvin monitored the frequencies. Progress was slow, hampered by her fatigue and the imperfect conditions. But by dawn, they had achieved a breakthrough, using a combination of her remaining vocal abilities and carefully timed breath techniques. Seren managed to produce a pattern that matched the critical frequencies of the original chant. It wasn't identical. No human or mechanical analysis would identify it as the same voice, but the underlying mathematical structure, the key that would open the Verilon defense systems, was there. "Again," Seren insisted, even as her voice grew hoarser with each attempt. "You need to rest," Kelvin argued. "Pushing too hard could cause permanent damage." She fixed him with a steady gaze. "Already damaged. Worth risk." Before Kelvin could respond, a soft ping from his security interface caught his attention. Someone had accessed the environmental controls for Deck 13, checking for life signs, just as he'd predicted. So far, their precautions had hidden them, but it was only a matter of time before the hunters began a physical search. "We need to move again," Kelvin said, already packing up their equipment. "They're getting closer." Serene nodded, her face set in grim determination. As they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, she suddenly clutched Kelvin's arm, her expression urgent. She pointed to the station schematic, specifically to a section marked Relay Node, Sector 11. "What about it?" Kelvin asked. "Communications," she managed, her voice strained from the practice sessions. "Send. Warning. New chant." Kelvin studied the schematic. The relay node was the station's primary communication hub, capable of sending encrypted transmissions across vast distances. If they could access it, they might indeed be able to warn the Verilon colonies about the compromised defense keys and provide the new pattern Seren had created. But it was a desperate gamble. The relay node would be one of the first places the Syndicate hunters would secure, and even if they reached it, using it would immediately reveal their position. "It's too dangerous," Kelvin argued. "We should focus on getting you off the station." Seren's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Not just me," she rasped. "Thousands. At risk. Must try." The force of her conviction silenced Kelvin's objections. She was right, of course. Whatever danger they faced paled in comparison to what would happen if the Syndicate gained access to the Verilon defense systems. Entire colonies, thousands of lives, hung in the balance. "All right," he conceded. "But we do this smart, in and out, as quickly as possible." The route to Sector 11 took them through the coldest parts of the station, areas where environmental systems had failed completely. They moved as quickly as they dared on the ice-slick floors. Every step, a potential betrayal. Twice, they had to backtrack to avoid patrol drones, adding precious minutes to their journey. When they finally reached the access corridor to the relay node, Kelvin held up a hand, signaling Seren to stop. Ahead, the sealed door to the communication hub gleamed in the emergency lighting. It should have been accessible with Kelvin's archivist credentials. But something was wrong. The control panel beside the door was dark. No power. "They've cut the direct supply," Kelvin murmured. "Standard procedure for securing sensitive areas during a breach." Seren pointed to a maintenance panel near the floor, her meaning clear. "The backup system," Kelvin nodded. "It might work, but it operates on minimal power. Not enough for the full relay, but maybe enough to open the door." Working quickly, he pried open the panel and rerouted the emergency power to the door mechanism. The control panel flickered weakly to life, but when he tried his access code, the system rejected it with a harsh buzz. "They've locked out standard credentials," he muttered. "We need another way in." Seren stepped forward, pointing to the small audio receptor beside the panel. A secondary authentication method, rarely used in normal operations. She looked at Kelvin questioningly. "Sound authentication?" he asked. "For this door?" She nodded, then carefully formed the words. "Archive, security, voice, patterns." Understanding dawned. As an archive facility, the Copenhagen ring had been designed with multiple authentication methods to protect its precious data. Sound patterns, specific frequencies that matched archived vocal keys, were one such method. A backup in case visual or tactile systems failed. "But we don't have the correct key for this door," Kelvin pointed out. Seren touched her throat. Then the pendant she now wore again. "Voice Keeper," she whispered. "Universal. Access." It was a desperate gamble, but the logic held. If Voice Keeper chants were designed to access Verilon defense systems, they might work on this human-built but universally compatible security system as well. The frequencies, the mathematical patterns underlying them, transcended specific technological implementations. "It's worth trying," Kelvin agreed, adjusting their equipment to record and analyze whatever Seren managed to produce. Steeling herself, Seren began the modified chant they had practiced. Her voice, still damaged but stronger than before, wavered on the higher frequencies, but held the essential pattern. Kelvin watched the analysis screen, holding his breath as the sound waves formed, matched against the door's authentication parameters. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a soft click and the groan of disused mechanisms, the door slid open a few inches, enough for them to squeeze through. The relay node beyond was dark, save for the soft blue glow of emergency lighting. Banks of communication equipment lined the walls, most of it powered down. At the center stood the main transmission console, its screens blank. "We need power," Kelvin said, already moving to the auxiliary control panel. just enough to send one message. While he worked to reroute what little emergency power remained, Seren prepared the transmission data, the warning about compromised defense keys, and the new pattern she had created. Her fingers flew across the datapad, compressing the information into a burst transmission that could be sent in seconds. "Ready," she whispered as Kelvin managed to bring the main console online. They had one chance. The moment they activated the transmission, their location would be revealed. The hunters would come running. "Destination?" Kelvin asked, poised to input the coordinates. Seren showed him a series of numbers, coordinates for a Verilon outpost well outside Syndicate territory, a safe haven where the warning could be received and distributed. As Kelvin entered the data, a soft yellow light began pulsing on the security panel. "Geroish," the interface announced, a perimeter breach alert. "They've detected the power usage," Kelvin said grimly. "We're out of time." With a final keystroke, he activated the transmission. The console hummed to life, the compressed data packet streaming outward to the distant stars. Seren watched the progress indicator, her expression tense with anticipation. 100% transmitted flashed across the screen, just as the distant sound of boots on metal reached their ears. "We need to go," Kelvin urged, already shutting down the console. "They'll be here any second." But Seren hesitated, her eyes fixed on the relay equipment. "Destroy," she said firmly. "Track signal. Find colonies." She was right again. As long as the relay remained intact, the Syndicate could potentially trace their transmission, putting the receiving outpost at risk. Working quickly, they rigged a plasma flare, normally used for emergency illumination, to overload near the relay's main processor. It wouldn't destroy the entire communication system, but it would fry the tracking components, erasing any record of their transmission's destination. They were halfway to the exit when the door slid fully open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the corridor lights. The hunter wore the distinctive mask of the Quran Syndicate's Enforcement Division, a sound dampener built into its structure to protect against vocal weapons. For a heartbeat, all three figures froze in tableau. Then, everything happened at once. The hunter raised a neural disruptor, a weapon designed to incapacitate without killing, perfect for capturing valuable assets like Seren. Kelvin lunged forward, wielding a spanner from the maintenance kit as an improvised weapon. Seren ducked behind a console, reaching for the heat rod they'd brought from Deck 13. The hunter's first shot went wide, sizzling past Kelvin's shoulder to scorch the wall behind him. The second caught him in the side, sending waves of paralyzing pain through his nervous system. He staggered but didn't fall, his momentum carrying him forward into the hunter's midsection. They crashed to the floor together, grappling for control of the disruptor. The hunter was stronger, trained for combat in ways Kelvin had never been. Slowly, inexorably, the weapon turned toward Kelvin's chest. A flash of blue light, a crackling sound. And suddenly the hunter convulsed, the neural disruptor clattering to the floor. Seren stood over them, the heat rod in her hand glowing with energy. Her face was a mask of fury and determination, her damaged voice producing a sound that was half growl, half chant. The hunter tried to rise, reaching for a secondary weapon, but Seren was faster. The heat rod connected again, and this time, the hunter went limp. "Kelvin," Seren rasped, dropping to her knees beside him. "Hurt?" The neural disruptor's effects were already fading, leaving behind a dull ache and trembling muscles. "I'll live," he managed. "But there will be more. We need to move." As if to punctuate his words, the plasma flare they'd rigged detonated with a muffled thump. Sparks showered from the relay equipment, followed by the acrid smell of burning circuitry. "That'll draw attention," Kelvin said, struggling to his feet with Seren's help. "We need to get off this deck, off this station if possible." They made their way out of the relay node, moving as quickly as Kelvin's recovering body would allow. Instead of returning the way they had come, They took a maintenance shaft that led deeper into the station's core, toward the docking bays. Behind them, alarms blared as the station systems detected the damage to the relay node. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also, perhaps, escape. The maintenance shaft narrowed as they descended, forcing them to crawl the final distance. When they emerged, they found themselves in a seldom-used cargo handling area adjacent to Docking Bay 3. Through a viewport, they could see a small courier ship, not the sleek, menacing craft the Syndicate hunters must have arrived in, but an older model used for routine deliveries to the station. "That's our way out," Kelvin said, nodding toward the ship. "If we can reach it." The space between their position and the docking bay was exposed. No cover, no place to hide if hunters appeared. They would have to move quickly and hope that the distraction at the relay node had drawn most of the Syndicate forces away. "Ready?" Kelvin asked, meeting Seren's silver gaze. She nodded, her expression resolute. Then, to his surprise, she reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. The gesture conveyed what her damaged voice couldn't: gratitude, trust, a connection that had formed in the crucible of their shared danger. "Together," she whispered. They moved as one across the open space, every sense alert for danger. The docking bay door responded to Kelvin's archivist credentials. Evidently, the hunters hadn't thought to lock down this less obvious escape route. Beyond it, the courier ship waited, its access ramp extended in preparation for loading supplies. They were halfway across the bay when a shout echoed behind them. Two more hunters had emerged from an adjacent corridor, neural disruptors raised. "Run!" Kelvin urged, pushing Seren ahead of him toward the ship. Energy pulses sizzled through the air around them as they sprinted the remaining distance. Seren reached the ramp first, scrambling up its incline with Kelvin close behind. A pulse grazed his shoulder, sending him stumbling, but Seren caught him, dragging him the rest of the way into the ship. "Close! Ramp!" she gasped, already moving toward the cockpit. Kelvin slammed his hand on the emergency control, and the ramp hissed closed just as the hunters reached it. Through the small viewport in the ship's hatch, he could see them preparing to force their way in. "We don't have much time," he called to Seren, limping to join her in the cockpit. To his astonishment, she was already initiating the launch sequence, her hands moving confidently over the controls. "You know how to fly this?" he asked, dropping into the co-pilot seat. She nodded, not taking her eyes from the controls. "Transport. Pilot," she managed between focused breaths. "Before. Voice keeper." Outside, the hunters had given up on the hatch and were attempting to override the docking clamps that held the ship in place. Alarms blared as the bay began to depressurize, standard procedure when unauthorized launch was detected. "They're trying to trap us here," Kelvin realized. "If they release the atmospheric seal before we break free..." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what explosive decompression would do to the small courier ship. Seren's hands flew over the controls, bypassing safety protocols, channeling all available power to the engines. The ship shuddered as it strained against the docking clamps. A metallic groan echoed through the hull, followed by a sharp crack as one of the clamps gave way. The ship lurched sideways, now held by only 3 points instead of 4. On the external camera feed, Kelvin could see the hunters retreating as the bay's atmosphere continued to vent into space. They had perhaps 30 seconds before complete decompression. "Overload! Port thrusters!" Seren instructed, her damaged voice tight with concentration. "When I... signal..." Kelvin positioned his hands over the relevant controls, understanding her plan. By overloading the port thrusters while the ship was still partially clamped, they would create torque, potentially snapping the remaining restraints. It was dangerous. They risked tearing the ship apart, but with decompression imminent, they had no choice. Seren met his eyes, silently asking if he was ready. Kelvin nodded, his finger poised over the thruster control. "Now!" she rasped. Kelvin slammed the thruster to maximum output. The ship screamed in protest, metal straining against metal. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, with a series of sharp reports like gunshots, the remaining clamps tore free. The sudden release sent them spinning away from the station, out of control and rapidly accelerating. Seren fought with the controls, gradually bringing their wild tumble into a manageable trajectory. Behind them, the docking bay finished decompressing. Any hunters who hadn't retreated in time swept into the void. Only when they were several kilometers from the Copenhagen ring did Seren relax her grip on the controls, setting a course away from known shipping lanes. Her hands trembled with the aftermath of adrenaline. Kelvin leaned back in his seat. The reality of what they'd done, what they'd lost, and what they'd gained, settling over him. The archive, his life's work, was behind them now. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, but also possibility. He turned to look at Seren, finding her already watching him. In her silver eyes, he saw not just exhaustion and lingering fear, but something else. A question, perhaps, or an invitation. "We made it," he said simply. "Together," she replied, her damaged voice somehow beautiful in its determination. They sat in companionable silence as the Copenhagen ring dwindled to a distant speck behind them. The small courier ship wasn't designed for long-distance travel, but it would get them to the nearest outpost, a terraformed moon known for its rain and geothermal fields, far from Syndicate influence. 3 days later, they made planetfall on that moon. The descent through its thin but breathable atmosphere buffeted the small ship, raindrops streaking across the viewport as they approached the surface. Below, blue-tinted dome homes clustered around geothermal vents, steam rising to meet the perpetual drizzle. When they finally stepped out of the ship, Seren paused on the ramp, her face turned upward to feel the rain on her skin. Kelvin watched as she closed her eyes, letting the moisture gather on her lashes and cheeks. It struck him then how long it must have been since she had felt rain. Real rain, not the recycled moisture of space stations and transport vessels. First rain since leaving home, she confirmed when she caught him watching. Her voice, though still damaged, had grown stronger with each passing day. The vocal exercises were working, slowly, but surely reclaiming what the Syndicate had tried to destroy. They found lodging in a prefabricated shelter on the outskirts of the settlement. Simple accommodations, but safe and dry. The locals asked few questions, accustomed to refugees and travelers passing through their remote outpost. On their 5th day planetside, confirmation came. The Verilon outpost had received their transmission. The warning about compromised defense keys had been distributed to all colonies, and Seren's modified chant pattern had been implemented as a temporary measure until more permanent security could be established. "You did it," Kelvin told her that evening as they sat watching rain streak down the transparent dome above their shelter. "You saved them." Seren shook her head, her silver eyes meeting his. "We did it," she corrected. "I would have died on Deck 13. The reminder of how close she had come to freezing to death sent a chill through Kelvin that had nothing to do with the weather. He had almost walked away from that alert, almost followed protocol and waited for the drones. "Why did you come?" Seren asked, as if reading his thoughts. "To Deck 13? Kelvin considered the question. Why had he broken protocol? What instinct had led him to that abandoned sector at exactly the right moment? "I lost someone once," he admitted quietly. "A refugee whose language I was documenting. There was an alert, a life support failure in her sector. I followed protocol, logged it for the maintenance drones. By the time they reached her..." He trailed off, the memory still painful after all these years. "Not your fault," Seren said gently. "Perhaps not," Kelvin agreed. "But I could have done more. When your alert came through, I thought, not this time, not again. Seren reached across the space between them, her slender fingers finding his. Thank you, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of all she couldn't yet express. In the days that followed, they established a routine. Mornings were devoted to Seren's vocal rehabilitation, the exercises growing more complex as her strength returned. Afternoons found them exploring the settlement, learning its rhythms and customs. Evenings were for planning their future, uncertain as it was with the syndicate still hunting them. 2 weeks after their arrival, Seren made a discovery that changed everything. A small cultural workshop on the settlement's eastern edge, led by a collective of archivists and linguists, not unlike Kelvin himself. They were documenting the songs and stories of the various refugee populations that passed through the moon, creating a living archive of displaced cultures. Join, Seren suggested immediately, her eyes alight with possibility. Your knowledge, their resources. Kelvin hesitated. After his exile, after losing his archives on the Copenhagen Ring, the thought of starting over was daunting. Yet the alternative, hiding forever, always looking over their shoulders, was hardly a life at all. We'll both join, he decided. Your experience as a voice keeper, my background in linguistics, together, we might actually make a difference. That night, Seren retrieved her brother's pendant from the small safe in their shelter. She held it up to the light, watching as the crystal caught and refracted the glow from their lamp. Ready, she said, her voice stronger than it had been since Kelvin found her. To record. Understanding her intention, Kelvin set up the audio equipment they had salvaged from the courier ship. It wasn't as sophisticated as what they'd had on the station, but it would serve. Seren closed her eyes, the pendant clasped in her palm. For a long moment, she simply breathed, gathering herself. Then, she began to sing. The lullaby that emerged was unlike anything Kelvin had heard before. Though her voice still cracked on certain notes, still bore the scars of what had been done to her. The underlying pattern, the mathematical precision of frequency and rhythm that defined Verilon music, remained intact. It was both ancient and immediate, a bridge between what had been lost and what might yet be preserved. When the final note faded, Seren opened her eyes to find Kelvin watching her, with undisguised wonder. Beautiful, he said simply. She smiled, a full, radiant expression that transformed her face. Healing, she corrected, echoing his words from weeks ago. Like us. Later that night, as rain drummed against their shelter's dome, Kelvin felt, rather than heard, the crystal in Seren's pendant begin to pulse with a soft, rhythmic glow. Synchronized, he realized, with the heartbeats of those who carried the memory of her people's songs. A sign that what they had fought to preserve lived on, despite everything the syndicate had tried to erase. A reminder that some things, memory, culture, connection, transcended even the coldest nights and the most desperate circumstances. As Seren slept beside him, her breathing deep and even, Kelvin made a silent promise. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, they would face them together, just as they had in the frozen corridors of the Copenhagen Ring, just as they had in their desperate escape, just as they would in all the days to come. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the past, nourishing the future.